Dr. Trish Burdo. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Joe. Glad to be here.
Excited to have you. Dr. Burdo, for our listeners who may not be familiar with you and your work, who are you and what do you do?
My name is Tricia Burdo. I'm a PhD. I'm a professor and vice chair of the Department of Microbiology, Immunology, Inflammation at Temple Lewis Katz School of Medicine. And I mostly do HIV research. I do some teaching and some other things, but I have a big research program at Temple Med.
What I'd like to do is get into AIDS. It's just something that is a disease I've heard about, don't really understand that much, but it's something I've heard of since probably back in the late 80s. I think it really came to head when I was in school. I remember Magic Johnson, one of like just the legends of sports, who was, I think, kind of in his prime of his career still, came down with it. We're like, whoa. And we thought he was going to die like in 3 days when we heard Magic got it. And he's still here. I want to talk about the disease, what it is, what it's not, what it's like living with it, the research you're doing, and how close we are to a cure. Does that work for you?
Sure, sounds great.
Yeah. Before we do that, I want to start back all the way from the beginning. What first inspired you getting an interest in research and in particularly AIDS?
I got my PhD from Penn State, College of Medicine in Hershey. So originally I'm from Massachusetts, but I was like applying to grad school and I said, you know what, I'm going to apply to this Penn State. So I applied to Penn State and I went to school there, and one of the faculty members there was doing really interesting research on HIV. His name was Brian Wigdal, Dr. Wigdal. So I rotated in his lab and then I just really enjoyed it. I wanted to study something that had some relevance to human disease. And because when you get your PhD, you can study things like sea urchins or you can study zebrafish, or I really wanted to study something that I felt really passionate about. And obviously growing up in the 80s and 90s, this is something I started my PhD in 98. So it was definitely a field that was still up and coming and very exciting to be a part of.
Yeah, I think sea urchins and zebrafish may be a great SpongeBob episode, but probably not a good podcast. At least I don't know if I could pull one off to make it interesting. So, first question for you here.
Yep.
And I'm coming at a street level here. We're talking John Q. Public, or is my knowledge of AIDS. How about this? What is AIDS and how does it differ from HIV?
So I'll start with the opposite. I'll start with HIV. So HIV is the virus. So it's human immunodeficiency virus. And AIDS is the disease that it can cause, which is acquired immune deficiency syndrome. So AIDS is really what we saw in the 80s and 90s, where we see this wasting syndrome. We saw a lot of people's immune system was just gone. They died really, really fast from this infection. But nowadays, we don't see AIDS as often because we had what we call antiretroviral therapy, which is medicine that basically protects people from getting that sick, right? So right now we think of it more of a chronic disease. So more of something like diabetes, right? So people are living with this disease, or living with HIV, but there's different kind of side effects that they have associated with it, but it's not really anymore this kind of where it used to be in the 80s and 90s, like a death sentence almost. So that's kind of the history of what it is behind the disease there.
Yeah, so from what I remember way back in the day when it first came out, like I remember it was almost like the gay disease, right? Like you would just think
Mhm.
like gay men got it, right? And it was like a taboo about it. It was like you had to live some sort of crazy lifestyle or do intravenous drugs or something to get it. When it first came out, from your research, what did they think it was, or what didn't they know about it? Like when it first came out, like everyone died, and now no one's fast forward 40
Yeah,
years
sure.
later, no one's dying. Like when it first came out, what was the initial perception medically?
Sure. So basically, people started getting these weird cancers. So that was kind of one of the really weird things. It's kind of like a skin cancer where you've seen the lesions. Have you ever seen the movie Philadelphia when
Oh yeah,
Tom
great
Hanks
movie.
and gets those blotches? Like
Yeah.
those were the cancer that people with HIV were getting. And so they were like, what's going on with this? They're wasting, their immune system is not great. They're getting this like very weird cancers, which we call opportunistic diseases. So diseases where you normally wouldn't get, but since your immune system is non-functional, then you get all these weird things. So like that, the cancer is one where those typical splotches. So that's historically what would happen. And so they didn't know, but they did a lot of research, and a lot of it was done at NIH. I'm sure you've heard of a man named Tony Fauci
Sure.
and COVID. So he did a lot of research and others on to figure out exactly what was causing this. And they figured out it was a virus, which they originally called not HIV, but they originally called it HTLV3 because there's another type of virus that they thought it was in the similar class. And then they discovered that it was all these things were caused by HIV, which is a virus. So it's a retrovirus. So it's pretty technical, but I think one of the reasons why it stayed around so long is that a retrovirus it's an RNA virus, so it has RNA inside, but it goes from RNA to DNA, and then that viral DNA can get into your cells and stay there. So even when you're on medicine, so like I said before, the ART that people are on with HIV, it will suppress the virus, but as soon as you stop taking the medicine, the virus will come back. It's because it incorporates into the DNA.
So actually part of the person, basically, like
Yeah, it's not something that is like transmissible. So if you were, say, an HIV woman with HIV, you couldn't give it to your children. It's not a genetic disease like that, but it hides inside your DNA of your cell. So basically, yes, it goes inside the cell. So it's one of these weird, it's not cleared. Where it's when you get a cold, you don't have or the flu, your body, your immune system fights it. It goes through this whole thing, and then it's cleared and it goes away. But this is the thing with HIV is it kind of never goes away, but people are on medicine to make it stay dormant.
So the medicine doesn't make it go away, doesn't cure it, the current medication, but it basically makes it go dormant. And then if they stop taking their drug cocktail at some point, how quick does it come back instantly or over a long period of time?
So basically, the data shows that within 2 to 4 weeks is 95% of people, it will come back. So it's pretty fast. So that's why, people living with HIV that are taking medicine, it's very, important for them to keep on their regimen, because the medicine is a cocktail, because every single drug that's in that cocktail is in charge of stopping a different part of the life cycle of the virus. Right. So the virus, it's pretty technical, but it's like the virus goes into the cell and then attaches to the cell, it goes into the cell, then gets into the DNA, it integrates, then it makes proteins, and then so it's all these different things. So you've heard of potentially things called like protease inhibitors or reverse transcriptase inhibitors or non-nucleoside inhibitors. Those are basically all parts of the viral life cycle that it's trying to stop. So you use a couple of those drugs so it stops different parts.
Wow.
But the one thing that none of them do is stop the DNA is already in the person's DNA.
Whoa.
Right. So it's a very interesting thing to think about. So that comes to like our research, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to remove the viral DNA from the host DNA using CRISPR.
I want to get to that in a second. So just
sure.
I'm going to go back to my fourth grade
go for it.
knowledge. Yeah, let's take a step back. So you brought up Fauci and RNA and DNA. I never heard of that until COVID. So how do we cure COVID? At least have a vaccine in 9 months that basically stops it from being a death sentence to like you have a cold for a day. And then here we are 40 years later, we still haven't cured AIDS. What's the challenge from difference between COVID and AIDS? If that's a fair question.
Yeah, so COVID is caused by a virus called SARS-CoV. Well, there's SARS-CoV-1 but COVID is SARS-CoV-2. So it's it's a coronavirus. So it's a different type of virus than HIV. HIV is a retrovirus. So like I said, that gets into the DNA. COVID is not a retrovirus. It's an RNA virus, but it doesn't incorporate into your DNA, right? So you can use different medicines or use different things to block it. So what they did for COVID was, remember how I talked about the viral life cycle? And so the virus first has to get into a cell. So there's a part of a virus, and for COVID, it's called the S protein or the spike protein. And then that binds with something on a cell and then can get into the cell, right? So what they did for the vaccine is they basically, it blocks that spike protein, right? And so they have antibodies against that spike protein. So it can't get into the It can't get into the cell. So that's
Okay.
one thing. And the reason why HIV, you can't, they try something similar, but it still doesn't work because as soon as you get the infection, it's already incorporated into your DNA, right?
Uh,
So they can have those drugs that will then block it from getting into more cells, but the damage is already done per se, right?
mhm.
So that's one of the main differences between the two. I think the reason why they did the COVID vaccine so fast is because a lot of it's because they had the infrastructure of studying for 40 years, stuff like HIV, right?
Mhm.
And those RNA vaccines that were used for COVID had also been tested for other things like Ebola and
Mhm.
Marburg virus and all these other crazy viruses that they had tried to use that mRNA. So it wasn't like they invented that for COVID. It was a technology that was already there, and they just basically applied it to this new virus.
Wow. That is so fascinating. It's like a real high level experiment. Like you're experimenting. What does this do? What does that do? This works for
Yep.
this, not for that. So fascinating.
Yeah, and
Um,
I mean, we wish it worked for all of it, right? Because I
yeah,
mean, sometimes the flu vaccines don't work.
yeah,
You
sure.
you ever get the flu vaccine and then you still get the flu?
Oh, sure. Yeah,
As
absolutely.
because with the flu, it's mixing up every year. So they say, well, this is what we think the flu is going to look like. But then as the viruses go under replication, they mix up and make mutations. And then it's like a new strain that they haven't really thought was going to be out there.
So,
So,
like the flu vaccine, something from my understanding is something like they're guessing a couple months in advance what's going to show
yeah,
up. Come winter
yeah,
time, they'll say these three or four we'll inoculate for these three or four. We're banking on these four are going to be here. And if it's something not in that strain, then you get the
yeah.
flu after you get the flu shot.
Yeah,
Got
and
it.
the problem with flu is that it's technical, but segmented RNA virus. So it has different RNA pieces. So
Hmm.
it can kind of mix in with, you can have A, B, and C. And so you can get part of A, part of B, part of C. And so maybe that's not a virus that they had predicted was going to be around, right?
Hmm.
So
Last
it's
flu
crazy.
question. If you get the flu shot, right, and say
Yeah.
you get a strand that's not in there. Since you have their cousins kind of blocked off, does it make it from getting really bad? Or do you have less of a flu if you get the flu shot and you have a strain that's not in that compared to someone who just never gets the flu shot?
Yeah, so it's a little bit complicated because it depends on kind of what flu that you're getting, right? Because you might have some immunity towards it. It might not be 100%, but then you still might get it, but not be as sick.
Yeah,
Or it could be the opposite, where you don't have immunity at all to it. So it's like you never had the vaccine. But
gotcha.
normally they're pretty close, right? So they try to predict what flu is going to be out there. So the ones they do are pretty close. So sometimes there is some coverage. So I would always recommend, though, I should say this, and maybe this is not for your podcast, but to always get the flu vaccine because the flu actually kills more people a year than COVID did in a normal year. Flu is, especially if you're older and immune compromised,
Yeah.
yeah, the flu can definitely kill you.
Oh, here's my last flu point. A year ago, I got my flu shot real late, and I got the flu like in October, like way before I even thought about getting the flu. It was still warm outside, like second week
Yeah,
of
sure.
October. I got the flu, and I got COVID like everyone did, like maybe a year before that. The flu hit me 10 times harder than COVID did. I was out for like a week with the flu, where COVID was like a bad day and a half. And
Yeah, sure. And COVID too, I don't know if you had the original strain before vaccinations, but it mutated over time in a good way for us that it was like less virulent, so it caused less disease, right?
mhm,
Whereas the original point when I said there's multiple different variants, and so
mhm.
it depends which one kind of pops out. So the COVID that popped out during the epidemic was a really nasty one, but as it spread through people, it got mutated, so it got less nasty, right?
And that's
So
that.
yeah. So all the, you hear they were calling it A, B, C,
Mhm.
whatever,
Yeah, yeah,
it's
absolutely.
all the way down the alphabet,
Yeah.
X, Y. Yeah. So it depends. Viruses are, I don't know, maybe I'm a nerd, but the viruses I think are cool because they change themselves and it's kind of scary, but
Here's a question. I'm in the drug industry on the sales side. You're on the opposite side, on the research side, like the preclinical side. Like
sure.
what I see a lot in the drug industry as a whole, everyone loves the Me Too. Like we have a class that does good, right? And then there's already three in that class They do
Yeah.
a fourth one that's marginally different than the other
Yeah.
three that are already there. And
Sure.
they just manage the symptoms that are already managed. And they just have
Yeah.
another option for the physician to
Yeah.
choose. Side effect profile might be a little different.
Mhm.
Efficacy might be a little bit different, but it's the
Yeah.
same. I guess my question is this: what motivated you to go for the bomb, focusing on the cure? Rather than just, hey, we'll put another inhibitor on the market and we'll get 30% market share and it'll be great for the stock price. What motivated you to focus on the cure rather than managing just the symptoms with another therapy?
Sure. I think the drugs out there right now, the antiretroviral therapy has come a long way, and it does do a really good job at managing this disease. But really, and so it's become kind of a, like I said before, a chronic condition. But really, it's people are never without HIV, right? So if they stop taking that medicine, they have HIV. There's a lot of stigma still in 2023 with HIV that has never gone away. So people, even though they're taking their medicine every day, there's a huge stigma to be a person living with HIV. And also, I think the main reason that I worked on studying the cure is that people with HIV, even when they're on their medicine, they get one big part of my research is they can get really early cardiovascular disease. So people with HIV can get increased like atherosclerosis, they can get increased like cardiac fibrosis, and they can go through heart failure. Another part that I study is people with HIV have cognitive issues. So they have mood disorders, they have it can affect their mental health, and it can also affect like their quality of life. So some people living with HIV, even that they're on these drugs, which are keeping them alive, they still have I said before, we call them comorbidities. So
Mhm.
they can have 10 other things that are affecting them. So, it's really still affecting their daily lives, even though they're living longer. And now, I don't know what the exact stat is now, but more than 50% of people with HIV are over the age of 50,
Really?
right? So now we're getting into this realm of like people with HIV are older, and now they're getting more of these other kind of diseases faster. Anything that's doing with aging, right?
Yeah.
Having HIV or living with HIV is accelerating that process for them. And so it's huge. And even if you look at the cardiovascular field, if you go to the doctor and they check you for cholesterol and HDL, LDL, right? And then they say, yes, you need to be on a medicine, or no, you don't need to be on a medicine to do that.
Mhm.
People with HIV still, after you account for that, they still have a lot of cardiovascular disease that is just due from HIV.
So even
Yeah.
if they manage their symptoms, they take their cocktail, that still brings about, they still have a higher incidence of cardiovascular disease.
Yeah. And men, it's 1.5 times more because men have a higher risk in general. But
Mhm.
in women, it's 3 times higher risk of cardiovascular
Wow.
disease.
Even if their symptoms are well managed.
Yes.
Wow, that's no joke. I just here, just quick Google. Still 39 million people,
39 million. Mhm.
39 million, cool.
Yep.
39 million people living with HIV in 2022.
Yeah.
It's a lot of people.
It
Wow.
is. And, it's crazy because since it is a manageable disease by antiretroviral therapy, I think the younger generation is not really like they didn't live through it like we did, like seeing how
Mhm.
devastating it, was in the 80s and 90s. And
Yeah.
um, yeah, I've heard from people, oh, is that still a thing anymore? And I'm like, yeah,
Yeah,
39 million people have that are
wow.
living with
And
HIV,
what percent of them, do you know, say out of that 39 million, what percent actually goes to AIDS now, from HIV to AIDS? Maybe they're not well managed or they don't take their drugs. Like,
Yeah, so all of the stuff we were talking about so far is, taking drugs and being well managed is this is in the US and Europe and those kind of countries. But I mean, there is still a huge amount of HIV burden in places like Africa or even Thailand, which is getting better. All those places that maybe they don't have access to as good as drugs as we do. They might have access to antiretroviral therapies, but the problem when you only have one of those drugs is that you can get resistance. So I'm sure you heard this in being in the drug field is you can get drug resistance, right? So
mhm.
I think before you were talking about why is there 5 drugs that do the same thing? Well, for HIV, it's because if you get a mutation, then another drug in the same class
Mhm.
might still help you, right? So
Sure.
that's why there's those other options. So I would say this is the first line regimen that you should use, but if you develop resistance, then there's more kind of stuff to go to in the same class because they're slightly different. So in HIV, I think that's a great thing for people with HIV that there's other options out there, right?
Mhm.
So I don't know offhand, to be honest with you, what the percentage is that people go to terminal AIDS right now. In the US is very, very little. But there's also people that are out of care, right? So not everyone
Yeah.
with HIV will go into care. Some people don't even get diagnosed until they show up at the hospital because they're really sick,
Wow. They still know they have
right?
it, or yeah, they don't go to the doctors. They just
Yeah.
ignore the symptoms for a while, something like that.
Yeah. And there's a huge burden of HIV in rural areas. So
Mhm.
like if you think about like the opioid epidemic in rural areas is huge. The
Mhm.
same with HIV epidemic is still huge in those rural areas. I still think even in the United States, we haven't addressed every population
Mhm.
and not every population is in good care, right? So I'm not sure the numbers, but I think it's still kind of a global thing that we need to get people with multiple diseases, not just HIV, into care.
Here's something, think of famous people like who went through
Yeah.
this. So the one I remember, the one is Magic Johnson. And Magic, I remember beating the Sixers back in the day in the championship, and he was
Well,
on the dream.
I'm a Celtics fan.
He's the best point guard. Jordan's probably the best shooting guard ever. And then you
Hmm.
see he has it, like, whoa. And then you remember growing up, the Brady Bunch, who didn't watch the
Yep.
Brady Bunch growing up in the 90s and 80s. The dad got it. The dad
Yep.
got it. Yep. Robert Reed, he dies of
Yep.
AIDS. A famous person who I obviously way before our time, but that, like they said, Rock Hudson was a famous movie star that got it. And
Yep.
I think it was Rocky Five. Rocky fought Tommy Gun Morrison. It was this like street fighter that Rocky,
Yeah.
it was one of the Rockies. And he was like the leading bad guy in that movie, and he died of it. So it hits the famous and not famous. And then I just Googled who's living with HIV now. And I didn't know this. Charlie Sheen.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it hits the famous, not
Yeah.
famous, rich, not rich. That's crazy in this day and age.
Yeah. And I just think even people with multiple sexual partners, even like young kids, I feel like there's still all these things to worry about, which terrifies me as being a mom of young girls. Is people think they don't really think about these things anymore. It used to, especially in our age, used to be like, don't get pregnant. But there's so many sexual transmitted diseases that, we definitely don't want to get for sure. So
Yeah.
there's still spread by intravenous drug use and with the opioid epidemic, fentanyl, all that stuff.
So let's fast forward now. You mentioned the word CRISPR. So we talked
Yeah,
about
yeah.
what motivated you to finding the cure. Tell us about your research, what you're doing, and where we are, and how far we are from a cure. Is that fair? Fair question?
Yeah, sure. It's great.
Yeah.
So, first of all, I'll tell you what CRISPR is. So, CRISPR is, we've heard a lot in the news lately about CRISPR. I don't know if you've heard of in China, they made CRISPR babies. So, they genetically modified babies okay, so that was a big thing in the news. There was also this thing on, I don't know if it was Netflix or whatever, but they have people that kind of CRISPR themselves because they want bigger muscles or they want all this stuff. So I think in the press, it's been really a thing that's like genetic gene editing. It's really scary to people. But I think what people don't understand is that CRISPR is used in a lot of diseases. So I'll tell you what CRISPR is. So it's a very long word, but CRISPR basically has two parts. So one is the Cas9, which is an enzyme. So that will tell you that does the cutting. So imagine you have DNA, you're going to cut some pieces out, right? So the Cas9 is the part that does the cutting. And then there's a second part is called a guide RNA. And that's just a piece of sequence that will tell you where to cut. So it's pretty much that's how I describe it is the one part tells you where to cut, the other part does the cutting, right? So in HIV, what we're trying to do, like I said before, HIV gets into the DNA. So what we're trying to do is specifically cut out using CRISPR that part of the DNA, that the viral DNA. And then your body has this really amazing way to repair DNA. So if you have any mutations or you're doing these things, your body can repair itself, which is kind of cool, right? So then it will repair it. So it will put those kind of back together. But basically, it can repair itself. And so that's kind of the strategy for us is trying to remove what we think is like the foreign DNA to repair the DNA. And in that way, and we're doing this in preclinical studies. So I do a lot of non-human primate work. So when we do that in these preclinical models, and then you stop the antiretroviral therapy, then there's no DNA there. So you lose the ability to get that virus to come back in and cause disease. So in people, obviously, that's the ultimate goal would be you would give them this CRISPR to remove the DNA. And then once you did that, you could remove them from their drugs and then they would be cured.
Wow.
And so there's a lot of different strategies. So that was one to directly target the virus. So that's what we're working on. And right now we've done it in monkeys and mice and showed that it's safe in those systems. And it can do what it, like we showed that it can cut the DNA, specifically where we're supposed to cut it. But we're doing a lot of things just to look at safety, because obviously these type of things are, you're going in there and cutting DNA, right? So that scares everyone. And if it's not really specific, then what we call is like off targets. So you don't want it to cut where it shouldn't cut, right? You're not going to do something where it's going to go and cut up all your DNA and take out pieces. So this
that
is
would be bad. That's what you
yeah,
call
that
bad.
would be bad.
That's bad. Okay.
So that's the strategy. And there's a lot of different scientific ways that we're looking to make it specific to just to HIV. And it starts like the sequence, your DNA is ATGC, all those things. So there's specific sequences that we can look at that are specific to the virus that aren't found in human, right? So we start with that. And then we go like layer down and look at different safety things. How do we deliver it? Where is it in the cells? All those type of things. So I think that it's a super cool technology and it has a lot of potential. And actually, I should say there's a company that's a spinoff from Temple called Excision Biotherapeutics. And they just started a phase 1/2 clinical trial to see if this product is safe in humans. People are starting to look at that. And CRISPR has been used in other diseases. I don't know if you heard of Spark Therapeutic. Have you heard of at Penn, there was 2 children that are blind, one little girl who's from Upper Dublin, actually, and then a little boy, and they have a rare genetic disease in their eye that makes them blind. And so basically they gave them a CRISPR therapy in their eye that removed the bad gene and put a new gene in. And then now they can see.
Wow, that's
And
incredible.
they did it in both eyes. And I remember talking to the parents and they said the first time she went outside and said, oh my God, I can see the stars, right? CRISPR has been used for a lot of, like, they're using it for sickle cell, to try to do sickle cell, these really like debilitating disorders like Duchenne's muscular disorder, which is basically kids will die if they have that. So CRISPR can be used in many things, like taking out a bad gene, putting in a good one. It can even change a single nucleic acid. So if you have a mutation that goes from, you can change one single thing. So it gets down to like really molecular levels, but on the power of it is that it's been used in all these diseases. And now I always think of these 2 kids that now they can see, whereas like they couldn't see because they had this disease.
The technology is just gets crazier and crazier and more impressive. That is wild.
And as a female scientist, I think it's super powerful because there's 2 women that got the Nobel Prize in 2020 for CRISPR in chemistry. One of the women, who is from California, Jennifer Duranda, she has like a book that I'll have to give to you. It's like the first time that 2 women had won a Nobel Prize in chemistry. So
with that technology, what do you think the major challenges are to developing a cure? Do you think we're like on the doorstep, or is this the first step? Like, where do you think we are? If you had to envision the next 10 years, like where is this like the first step towards a cure, or what do you think?
Personally, I am optimistic. I think that it's really promising. And there's been a lot of different things that we've done in the past as a field that really hasn't been as promising as this, right? One other technology that has been used for HIV cure is a bone marrow transplantation. So I don't know if you've heard there's been a couple people that have been cured of HIV.
Okay.
Okay, so they all had leukemia of some sort. And so a bone marrow transplantation is basically when you get radiation to kill off all of your immune cells. So it makes you super, super, super sick. You kill off all your immune cells, and then they give you an infusion of new bone marrow cells. So bone marrow cells are stem cells, and stem cells can then repopulate and make new immune cells.
Mhm.
So what they did in this case is they took the bone marrow from a person that had a mutation in the cell receptor called CCR5 for HIV. It's called CCR5 delta 32 because it's missing like a chunk.
That sounds like an Eagles play. Something the play that like
It does.
Sirianni would call in for third and long or something. Yeah.
Yes, true. This is a
Okay.
third and long. This is a you can't use this strategy in the general population or people that don't have cancer because a third of people that get bone marrow transplantations die just from getting the bone marrow transplantation.
Wow.
It's bad. It's like if you have cancer and you're going to die, like this is something last resort type of thing
Okay.
for people. So it's not something that could be readily used. But I think that gave the field this kind of, it gave them a kind of hope that there is something out there that we could use. And so we've been using some other strategies that are based on that. But anyway, so the people would get the bone marrow from another person. 1% of the population has this Delta 32 mutation, and it makes them so they can't get infected with HIV, basically. And so they got the bone marrow, and then the person, that cell would grow in the person's body and kind of take over, and then they were cured.
Mhm.
They couldn't find any HIV in
Wow.
these people's bodies. But this is some extreme case, basically last resort for cancer, but they used it to try to cure these people. So that happened in I think 2 or 3 people now. So that kind of was very exciting.
So that's they're off all meds and they almost died, but they went to the brink and then they
Yep.
came back. And when they came back, the AIDS was gone.
Yep. The
Wow.
HIV was well, yeah. And actually, but since then, one of them who was HIV free for 13 years, he died of leukemia. So
Wow.
he got cancer again and died and passed from
Jesus.
cancer, but he never, and he donated his body to science. So I think they can't find any HIV anywhere that
Wow.
they've looked at. So they called the first one was the Berlin patient, and the second was the London patient. And actually, the London patient, I've met them both actually, but the London patient has come to Philly a couple times to give like talks and stuff.
Really?
But yeah, his experience. Yeah, so it gave the field hope after 40, 30, 40 years that they could. So I think we're on to something. The technology is improving, I think, almost on a daily basis. But I think we're still far off from CRISPR because to be in mainstream because there is potential side effects. There is,
What are
you
the side effects? That was my next question. What are the side effects of CRISPR from just regurgitating what you said or repeating what you said? It goes in, there's two parts. One finds that part of the
yep,
DNA they need to find. They have the guide and then the clipper. And
yep,
then they guide, they said this part of the DNA is where the
yep.
HIV virus is.
And the
Then
other,
they clip
yep.
it. So what type of just say it's a clean find and a clean cut. What type of side effects do you find so far?
Yeah, starting on the infusion. So you would, any type of, so we would infuse this into a person
So
because
it's not a pill, it's an infusion.
it's an infusion. Yeah.
Okay,
So
so
it's an
you infuse the
infusion.
CRISPR in. Okay.
Yeah. So the way that I like to discuss it is when you can get a vaccine that's in like what they call an adeno associated viral vector. So it's in a viral vector, like a dead viral vector. They put the DNA in there that has this cutter and it has the sequence. And so they have it's going to be like a big saline bag. You do a slow drip.
Mm.
Anytime you're infusing something into a person, regardless if it's CRISPR or not CRISPR, there's possibilities of infusion reactions, like just inflammatory reactions. But that could be basically just in general, right?
Mhm.
But then there's also people could have some type of inflammatory reaction to the product. They can have like an like immune response
Mhm.
to whatever you're having. So they could have an adverse or immune response. And that can happen anything. Like some people get vaccines and get some bad immune responses. It's not common, but it can happen, right? But
Mhm.
then on the CRISPR side, you want to always make sure it's hard because right now in the clinical trials, they're looking at people 30 years, 15, I think it's 15 years. They have to follow people for 15 years because they want to make sure in 15 years they don't develop some crazy cancer or
Sure.
something, right? But the
Absolutely.
technology is so new that we haven't seen any of those things, but it doesn't mean that 15 years from now some signal won't come up, right?
Yeah.
But for most people that are getting these now, they might not even live to 15 years if they don't get these kind of medicine, this kind of
Yeah.
like therapies, right?
Wow. There's so many
Um,
considerations. Oh my
so
gosh.
there's so many. And so we're trying the best to like look at all the different safety things, right? So you want it to do the best job it can with the least amount of side effects. And again, like I said, the CRISPR is hard because you're manipulating DNA. So you want to absolutely be sure that you're doing that in the correct way, right? Because, but I think the power of it is like amazing, and it's just shown how far it's come
Yeah.
very quickly. Yeah. So there's a lot of considerations.
When you say like, so funny, you go, you want to manipulate the DNA in a correct way. I think that's a good idea. That's good. Like if
Yeah.
your DNA, one, we have the ability to manipulate anyone's DNA. It just blows my mind. Like that is crazy. I think if you said that to maybe someone looking into this in the 80s, it would be like the
Yeah.
aliens would land on the planet, right? I mean, that has to be so foreign. If you mentioned that to
Yeah.
a researcher 40 years ago,
Yeah.
what do you think their reaction would be? Like, this is what we're doing.
Yeah, it would be like sci-fi stuff, right? Stuff you see on
Yeah.
TV. And I still feel like there's so many people that think that, like sci-fi. And that's why I said at the beginning, CRISPR has been, if it's utilized in a correct way, like he made babies the way that he wanted. He's in jail. He CRISPR'd them. It's
Whoa,
kind of
that's
like he wanted. I don't know. So like there's those things, and there's people that take this technology and they're like, oh, instead of going to the gym every day, I can CRISPR myself some big muscles. And if there's all these,
whoa.
I
So
can show you
that's
all these resources. And I wish I could remember there's a Netflix special or something. It was like, oh, what's it called? Let's see if I can find it. CRISPR. It's like people that,
so you could say, oh, I want to be ripped, and you could mess with the DNA if you know what you're doing, and you could like clip the things that would not make you ripped, so you look better without doing the work.
yeah. So that kind of gives like the whole technology makes it scary because people are out there just doing whatever the hell they want to do with technology that should be used to save people's life, but then they're like, oh, I think I should do
They,
X, Y, and Z.
they do more like cosmetic things. It's more like the cosmetic
Yeah, yeah.
side. That's
But I mean, I think the same. I mean, we can say that with a lot of things, right? Because like plastic surgery came, so
yes.
yeah.
No, it totally makes sense. How about this? If you were to sketch out optimistically, and this is an optimistic sketch, if you said, all right, best case scenario, walk us through the next 10 years of the milestones. And if you had to put a dollar on, you know what, if this CRISPR is what you think it is, when do you think we cross the goal line and say cured? If that's a fair question.
Sure. Wait, before we do that, I found the show that you have to watch because it's really crazy.
Go
It's
ahead.
called Unnatural Selection.
Okay. Unnatural selection. Okay.
It's on Netflix.
Okay. Unnatural select. I will put that in the show notes and I will take a look at that. Unnatural selection. That sounds crazy to be. That's just, you can just tell it sounds crazy. Okay.
So getting back to your other question. So putting a timeline on,
When you cross the goal, when do you think we could cross
yeah.
the goal line and say touchdown cured?
Yeah, so that's like a really super loaded question.
Yeah, sure. And I know
Because
it's almost an
yeah.
unfair question. You can
Well, yeah,
just
because
answer
we
it.
haven't done like in 40 years, we've had just a handful of people. So it's hard to say.
Yeah.
But I think it's hard because I think, we didn't start using CRISPR for HIV until 2014 or 15.
Okay.
Right. And so it's been not even 10 years. And
Yep.
we've come from just learning about this technology to putting it in people. So it's for technology, like that's pretty fast. So I can just imagine in the next 10 years, I feel like we'll come so much closer. I don't want to say we will cure. And I mean, HIV is so crazy and there's so many different things on multiple levels that it changes, it can hide in the body. Different people have different reactions to stuff. And so I think we'll see it used in people in the next 5 years for sure. But I don't know if we'll say like we are curing it by this. And I should say that this technology alone might not be enough, but we might use it in combination with something else.
Sure. Yeah.
Then would be, you know what I mean? So
Absolutely.
there's all different like immunologic techniques that people are using. So maybe you would use a CRISPR and an immunologic technique to then cure something. So I think that, yeah, I don't know. Put it this way. I'm excited to see in the next like 10 years
Yeah.
where all this kind of goes because it's been less than 10 years and we've come this far. So I think,
Yeah. That's phenomenal. First off, hats off to
yeah.
the work you and your crew's doing and everyone trying to make the world a better place. It's just the way my brain works. I divide like diseases into two things. There's like the treatment, right? like the cure, and then there's the vaccine, the prevention. Like,
Sure.
is there a vaccine being worked on? Like, this is like the treatment where you have it and we're going to try to take it out of your body and cure
Yeah.
you.
So
Like,
there is a number of vaccines aren't my specialty, but
sure.
they've been working on a HIV vaccine for 40 years.
Okay. Wow.
So just to, getting back full thing to what we talked about for COVID, how that took 18 months or something, right? Maybe a year. I don't even remember. It was very fast. But for HIV, it's been 40 years people have been working on a vaccine.
Wow.
So, but I mean, if you look at how far vaccines have come, then there's always new technologies like the mRNA. Now people are
Mhm.
using that for trying to use that for HIV. But HIV, I mean, it gets into your DNA, right? And so that's always the thing because a vaccine is basically on the antibody response, right?
Mhm.
So you put something in your body, you make an antibody response to it. So the next time your body sees it, it has a leg up, right? And then it can fight it. And so people have tried that with HIV, but it's never like enough, right? They get more and more promising results, but yeah, it's tough. Now what they have for HIV prevention is PrEP.
Mhm.
And so that is antiretroviral drugs basically people are taking as a prophylactics. It's not a vaccine, but that has had very good ability because it stops the replication cycle of the virus, right? So
Mhm.
a vaccine is an antibody mediated response, whereas if you use these drugs, they stop the virus from integrating or replicating or stuff. So that's been more effective than a
No,
vaccine.
no, thank you for sharing that. Couple questions here just to wrap up.
Sure.
One, so good. I appreciate you walks us through this. I feel like I can get 3 more credits in my college transcript for the science class I never took in microbiology.
You
Thank
should go
you.
back and do that.
Yeah, I got three. I have 131 credits now instead of 128. How about this? What advice would you give to, say, an inspiring researcher, maybe some young guy or girl out there that's interested in pursuing a career in HIV virus research or similar fields? What advice would you give them?
First of all, anyone going into research at this point, I think it's like super exciting. There's the technologies are amazing, right? So when I was a PhD student, we would always laugh that sequencing, instead of just sending it out to a company and it's done, you can sequence the whole genomes now. We would put them on these big gels, right? So I think you can accomplish so much more now. And it's just super exciting. I would, if anyone is interested in science and doesn't want to be a medical doctor that deals with patients, like this is an amazing way to get that same gratification out of it, and you have so much academic freedom, right?
Mhm.
You can study whatever you want and really kind of like figure stuff out, and then you can see in the end that could maybe help lots of people, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
So to me, I just think it's exciting. Yeah, and I'm yeah,
It's,
every
it's,
day I look forward to my job and going out there and figuring out what we can work on. And the other part too that I didn't really discuss today is I work a lot with the community. So we have 2 grants that have a community aspect. So I actually get to work side by side sometimes with people in the community. So people that are living with HIV. And so I think that's a really important aspect too when you're doing research, because some people are so focused on what they're doing, but they don't realize how do people in the community think about gene editing and CRISPR for HIV. Like that's such an important factor, right? Because if we develop a technology that could be used in people, but then people don't accept it. So we're working a lot on kind of education and talking to people about getting their feedback from the beginning. So I think that's another important thing, I think. And it's very, to me, it's very satisfying because you're not working in this closed circle. You're,
yeah. You're out with the people. You're actually the people that are living with the disease in the present day. That's
yeah,
pretty,
yeah, exactly. And
that
so I
is pretty
think that
powerful.
is, super, rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely. How about this? We spoke about so much about the HIV virus, AIDS, the famous people that are affected, or the work that's going on. What's it like doing research and being involved with the community? Dr. Burdo, if you could have everyone listening take just one lesson away from everything we discussed,
Sure.
what would that lesson be?
So especially for the younger people that didn't live through this huge HIV epidemic, which is still an epidemic to date, it's still out there and it's still affecting the lives of people. I would just say my main point is don't blow it off. Don't think it doesn't exist anymore. It does, and it's very can be very debilitating. It's something that you will literally live with the rest of your life until there's a cure. So that's kind of my take home message is it's
Be,
still out there. It's not like
still
you saw in the movies. It's a whole different ballgame.
still out there. Be vigilant, be safe, that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And then how about this? To lighten it up a little bit,
Yeah.
two fun questions I ask these two questions to every guest. Sometimes they
Okay.
hit, sometimes they don't. But how about this? Yeah, fun one. Totally a non sequitur, totally unrelated. If you
Okay.
could spend the day with anyone, alive or dead, famous, not famous, just spend the day with them, who would you spend the day with?
All right. So it's going to be really nerdy. So I would say Tony Fauci.
Really? Okay, go ahead. What would you do and how would you spend the day?
Well, I mean, just going and maybe more like when he was involved in like the government and like COVID responses and stuff. I just think he's just like such a smart guy. And I just think it's a day in his life would be very exciting, but very, he's in his 80s now and he was doing all that stuff with COVID when he was 80. I just think, wow, I'm only 47. Hopefully, when I'm 80, I can still be like killing it out there. And if everyone in the world is looking at him to say, like, what the hell did we do during COVID?
Very
Right. So
well.
like I thought that would be really interesting to see how he handles everything. And yeah.
Probably one of the more influential or infamous people that you would in the last 5 years, without question. I mean, one of the most famous people in the world. I mean, during the COVID thing, he was
Yeah,
on
for sure.
TV every 20 minutes. Wow, no, thank you for sharing that. How
Yep.
about this, Dr. Burdo? If you had to get a quote or a saying tattooed on your body,
Okay.
what would that quote or motto say?
So this is probably one from my personal life and like from all this is something from my fitness journey that I always said it and I always says it was like progress, not perfection. Right. So like always moving forward in your life and trying to like you're never going to be perfect, you're never going to hit everything 100%, but if you're making progress and you're working your hardest and kind of doing that. So I always think like that's important, right? You don't have to be perfect, but you need to be like always moving forward and always making progress and always trying to like better yourself.
Progress, not perfection, I think is about as good as a spot as any to wrap this up. Dr. Tricia Burdo, like to thank you for joining us. It was awesome to speak with you and I appreciate you.